We have present with us tonight a former member of the Tyler Executive Committee who has served us for so many, many years, and a man who resigned over our total protest, but finally decided it's time to get off, and I think he's well worth recognizing again this evening. Jim Maloney. Jim, stand up. Speaking for the Executive Committee, Dr. Cornelius Sullivan will make the presentation to Professor Galloway.
Good evening. You've heard a lot. You've heard about the alphabet soup and about science and international programs. But I'm really just here because I'm honored this evening to present this year's John and Alice Tyler Award for Environmental Achievement to Professor James N. Galloway from the University of Virginia. Well, at least half of the prize, because as you just noticed, he shares that prize this evening. Jim, however, is recognized for his fundamental contributions to improving our understanding of major biogeochemical cycles and the impacts of human activities on these important cycles of chemical elements such as nitrogen and sulfur. Now there's an SAT word in there. It's called biogeochemical cycles, and those of you who are into the etymology of words understand these are chemical cycles that living things, bio, influence, and they have such broad and pervasive impacts that they impact the geode, or the earth. So that's your SAT word for this evening. In particular, Jim has made fundamental contributions in pioneering studies of the emergent problems of acidic deposition of watersheds, basically acid rain influencing our freshwater ecosystems, the atmospheric transport of anthropogenic emissions, and the growing intervention of humans in the global nitrogen cycle. For anybody who missed anthropogenic, that just means we humans are at the root of the problem of these emissions. In particular, the Tyler Committee recognizes and wishes to highlight the importance of an Earth system science approach in Jim's research that leads to we think, to a deeper understanding of these phenomena. In addition to his fundamental scientific contributions, Jim has been a world leader in bringing together disparate constituencies of the scientific community to develop a coherent and a large-scale story, not just a static picture, but a story of human impacts on the biogeochemical cycles. Most recently, and notably, have been his efforts highlighting the nitrogen cycle and developing the concept of what he has designated the nitrogen cascade, which in the next 10 minutes you may learn a little bit more about. But this is a critical and quite a dynamic part of the story, and it's this dynamism that is important in science. Actually, I think it's the reciprocal interactions between these cycles and humans and these cycles of chemical nutrients or pollutants, depending on how you look at them, that has been elucidated so well by Jim's research. Moreover, Jim well understands and has been instrumental in getting critical scientific information and conclusion to policymakers and to the general public in order to influence, or at least help influence, national and international policy in a very positive way for the benefit of all of us in the room. You'll note that these are characteristic of both of our distinguished laureates tonight. They are what my former boss, Neil Lane, who was then director of the National Science Foundation and then later the President's Science Advisor during the 1990s, in a very thoughtful article called Citizen Scientists. A lot of scientists really aren't comfortable in moving out of the laboratory with their results, explaining it as we expect to the neighbor in the next laboratory and their colleagues in a language that they understand, but going beyond that to explaining what they discovered and what that scientist's passion has been over a major part of their life that has meaning for all of our society. That's a very special person in the science community. And I want to highlight for you this important aspect of both of their work and to congratulate both laureates on a job well done. But I think it's important to recognize that this is a job that we all know remains very much ongoing. Finally, I'd like to point out that Professor Galloway's fine academic pedigree. A graduate of the University of California, San Diego, with graduate studies at Scripps Institution of Oceanography, which just happens to be my own pedigree, so I'm kind of riding on the coattails of Jim tonight to say that we had a pretty good training that got us to where we are. But I'd like right now to have you join me in congratulating James N. Galloway for this very well-deserved recognition. I've particularly kept my presentation short so that Jim would have his 15 moments in the sun here next to Hollywood. And I can only say that the only time I've done a better job of this is once a long time ago when I had dinner with the Prime Minister of New Zealand and the American ambassador to New Zealand on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of the United States Antarctic program, which I led at that time. And when I got up, after looking at my notes in front of the mirror in my hotel room, it wasn't until I got up to speak and I was shuffling around and I forgot half of my notes, about 6 out of 12 pages, back in the room of the little motel that I was staying, and it was the last half of those notes that I had actually left. So I had to think of all the introductory notes that led up to the last 6 pages of where I was. And what was most interesting to me when I got back to the table, the Prime Minister said that he was glad to see that I had developed the acumen of a great speaker who took time to develop the audience's anticipation of what I was about to say by shuffling through my notes. And I didn't have the nerve to tell them. They were back in the hotel. I'm sorry. Jim, would you please come? Take your notes. There's your medal. James Galloway. Lovely. Thank you very much. This plaque says to James N. Galloway, Department of Environmental Sciences at the University of Virginia, in recognition of your quantitative characterization and detailing of biogeochemical cycles, the multiple impacts of human inputs to them, and the consequences for the global environment, particularly as illustrated by your development of the nitrogen cascade. My pleasure.
Thank you.
The podium is yours, sir.
The check for his wall, the plaque for his wall, the check for his wife.
Thank you very much.
The check is not in the mail, it's delivered.
I was
Thank
told
you,
it was
Alice.
empty. Neil, thank you. Thank you all for attending. Rosina, I had forgotten about People magazine. And I was not the centerfold. It was either Sylvester Stallone or Arnold Schwarzenegger. And one of those, I think, is well known to the people from California. So I'm not sure. And I'm going to say a few words later on about my family, but I have to say, my family is correct. I should not have ever been given an iPhone. For those of you who are sitting up front, you heard Joan Baez wafting through. And to be honest, I had the phone on because of my father being in the hospital, and I wanted to catch, but I must have hit the wrong button. And so, I was frantically pushing things, and I don't know how to turn the sucker off. So let's start over. Neil, thank you. Thank you to Linda. Thank you to the Tyler Committee. Thank you to Doug Capone. Doug, where are you? Nominated me for the Tyler Prize. We are long-term colleagues. He's a patient man, and I'm not referring to Linda. Nancy and I are delighted to be here tonight. I'm especially delighted to be sharing this honor with Hal Mooney. Hal used the term earlier this evening, hero. I have often felt Hal was a hero of mine for his pioneering work. And Hal, thank you for your leadership. Thank you for being an inspiration to all of us, especially to me. Nancy. She's a patient woman. What more can I say? She's my rock and my foundation. Joshua and his wife Neville and Anna and her husband Cyrus. The outcome of one of the many outcomes of my marriage with Nancy. They are wonderful people, just wonderful people. Norveen and father in absentia, father who raised me the person I am. All the great things are from his leadership, his inspiration, and with my late mother, Alice Best. All the mistakes are probably mine, but I've rarely been this humble. We talked about mentors earlier. You know, I have 3 mentors. Let me interrupt. So I was going to Hal and I were talking about how long that we should talk. And we agreed 5 minutes. Hal, I'm going to buy you a watch. No, Hal. Your remarks were great. I was actually going to type out my remarks and have them well prepared, but because of the events of this afternoon, I have what's called a mind map, and so it's going to be briefer for all of our benefits. But mentors. After I got my PhD at University of California, San Diego, in chemistry, Nancy and I stopped doing science and education. We moved to the mountains of Virginia and became potters, professional potters, for 2 years. And our first child, Joshua, was born there. And one day out of the blue, I got a letter from a guy, Gene Likens. And so when I was a potter in the mountains of Virginia, and Gene was looking for a postdoc to work on this thing called acid rain, he sent me a letter and said, do you want to come back to science and help me with this thing called acid rain? I said, yes. Nancy and I said yes. In one day, we bought our first house, our first ever new car, moved to Ithaca with Joshua. Anna was born there, and I just got very involved in acid rain, which led me to nitric acid in the atmosphere. And then I kept asking questions. Where does this nitrogen go after it acidifies lakes? What does it do when it gets there? And where does it go after that? And so over this course of 20, 30 some years, I've developed this nitrogen cascade. And so my first 2 scientific mentors are Jim Arnold, who was unable to be here tonight due to illness, and Gene Likens, who for some flimsy excuse, and Gene is a former with Herb Borman, a Tyler Award winner, he's in Australia and just couldn't make the trip. Anyway, and then, so when I was a postdoc with Gene Likens, I met Ellis Coley of North Carolina State University. And Ellis is a grand man, a very grand man. And he took this brash young man under his wing and helped him develop the skills with which to communicate not only with scientists, but with the public. So I would like to acknowledge Jim Arnold, Gene Likens, and Ellis Coley. My colleagues are several. You can't do environmental sciences in a vacuum. I am in the environmental sciences department. I've never had an ecology class, meteorology class, hydrology class, or geosciences class. I'm a chemist. I mean, so you have to throw some science in there. You have to have some chemistry. And so, but I rely on colleagues in an interdisciplinary sense, both from my department and at the University of Virginia, which has been very supportive of my research, and also colleagues in this country and in countries all around the world to help develop this nitrogen cascade. And so I am the first author in the paper, but there are many people who contributed to this. And they're too numerous to mention, but I acknowledge them and their work, not only in this country, but around the world. We can't do environmental sciences without this collaboration. I've mentioned about around the world. We're going to have we are having a grand evening tonight. We're going to have a wonderful dinner, continue to have a wonderful dinner. We are a privileged group of people to have these resources to use. Most of the world doesn't have them. And so we have an opportunity to use the energy and the enthusiasm for events like this to move out and go beyond our borders, our mental borders and our physical borders, and engage the people around the world to not just talk about carbon or nitrogen, but the whole human interaction with the planet. So Neil mentioned that I might say something about the cascade. I'm not. That's old. What I hope to use, what I plan to use some of the Tyler funds for, are this development of the nitrogen footprint. I mentioned this in the talk yesterday about trying to educate us and educate the public about what it means to you when you use a set amount of energy and consume a set amount of food, what it means to the loss of nitrogen in the environment, and what this does to the ecosystems and the people who interact with that excess nitrogen. And it's not just the excess nitrogen, it's also those large regions of the world that don't have enough nitrogen in their systems to sustain their basic dietary needs. So saying to sustain their basic dietary needs is probably the poor way to end right before we have a great dinner. But I wanted to make this point tonight because we are an influential group of people, and we have the ability not only to change our own lives and the lives of people around us, but the lives of a much broader community. With that, I thank you for this great honor, and I look forward to working with all of you in our mutual goals. Thank you.